Hello. In the Crown of Aragon 639 years ago, it was June 13th, 1387. My name is Jonathan Seyfried. I'm a PhD candidate in history at the University of New Mexico, and this is the Historian's Notebook, a podcast about how history gets made. Season 1 is titled Multcara Companiona. We're looking at a document from each day of the first year of the reign of King Joan I of Aragon and Queen Violante de Bar. Let's begin today's document. This document is on folio 2R of Joan's Commune Sigilli Secreti register. It's the one that we looked at. It's the register that we looked at from a couple episodes ago, where it was like the very first folio of the register we had a document from. And then today's document is the one that was identified by Daniel Girona y Llagostera for his itinerary for Joan's reign. So this document has been viewed before by Daniel Girona y Llagostera, but I'm not sure how much attention it's gotten beyond that. And goodness gracious, it's interesting. Oh my gosh. So I'm so excited to talk about it. It's a Latin document, and I put it through Gemini and then through Claude. And this is from a register that I did not have go through the agentic AI pipeline. It's not even one that I had identified as priority for downloading the images. So I had to go to Pares in order to get these. And of course, right now, Pares, and I am recording this way early in June because I'm going to be out of town the second week of June. And so what I can say is that as of the first week of June, Pares is still not accessible for IP addresses coming from the United States. And so I had to use a VPN and go through France in order to get to Pares and to these digitized images. Okay, so I did not prioritize this register, and I am really happy that I had my attention brought to it by the fact that there weren't other documents around for June 13th, and I went to Daniel Girona y Llagostera. So it turns out that this document is to the King of Cyprus. And I was really proud of myself because the later handwriting that is in the space above the start of this document at the bottom of folio 2R, it has pro hugere or hugone. It's really, this is hard to read. I think this cursive is harder to read right now for me than the Gothic secretarial hand from the 14th century. And it's because I could figure out day, but I was like, what is going on between day and then passe or pace? What? And then I looked at the addressee line on folio 2V, and I was like, what? That is definitely not that same person who's mentioned in the note from later, right? The maybe 18th century cursive at the top of the document. It's a king of something, and I was like, is that a T or a C? So I was thinking maybe like Tripoli, but then I settled on C, a soft C, IP, and then that is that little mark above the P slightly diagonal. It's almost always an abbreviation for an RI or an RE. And so we have either like Tipre or Cypre, and Cypre is Cyprus. So I stopped myself thinking, I've never heard of Joan or any monarch of the Crown of Aragon writing to Cyprus, writing to the King of Cyprus. And then the way that this letter starts is Illustris Princeps et consanguine, like a relative, consanguine carissime, most dear relative, or, not a cousin, but somehow related. And I was just not aware of any connection between the royal family of Cyprus and the royal family of the Crown of Aragon. So I went to Wikipedia and I looked at the kings of Cyprus, and I found James I, the king of Cyprus. He was crowned in 1385, but he had actually been named king before that. My goodness, if you just read this Wikipedia page for James I of Cyprus, it is like so dramatic. Oh my gosh. Okay, I don't even know how to summarize. I mean, getting into like the twists and turns of Cyprian politics from these decades, the second half of the 14th century, it's just like really dramatic because the previous king's father was murdered. Yeah, and so that king was murdered and his son took over, but then his son, Peter II, also died, but not before getting into this weird alliance with Genoa. And then, but like Genoa is like totally love-hate for Cyprus because sometimes people are making deals with Genoa. Turns out that this king who Joan is writing to in 1387, he was part of the plot to kill Peter I of Cyprus. And he made a deal with the Genoese in order to pull it off. And so the Genoese are like mucking around in internal Cypriot royal family politics. Turns out that the husband of that king who got murdered was a cousin of Per the Ceremonious, Joan's father. Are we following all of this? I mean, it's not, I'm excited, but I've just been spending time with the Wikipedia page for a while and like figuring out all this stuff. And I'm hitting you with it all in just this one stream of consciousness, family intrigue story. Goodness gracious. So let's just take a step back. Per the Ceremonious, Joan's father, he had a long reign. And in the 1350s and 1360s, he made a lot of moves to try to promote a dynastic alliance with the monarchs of Cyprus. So there are a lot of women who are from the Crown of Aragon. I mean, there were three. So there were three different women who were from the Crown of Aragon, from noble families. None of them like a daughter of the king, not quite that noble, but like cousins of the king, who got married into prominent Cypriot families. And Eleanor, there's a lot of Eleanors, by the way, but there was an Eleanor who was a cousin of Per the Ceremonious, and she married the king of Cyprus, I think before he became king, when he was a prince. So Peter I of Cyprus was married to Eleanor of Aragon, who was Per the Ceremonious's cousin. And this marriage was arranged, negotiated by Per the Ceremonious. It was his plan. So one of his favorite things to do, it seems, is marry off members of his family to different Mediterranean island royalty. It's something that he tried to make Joan do, and Joan rebelled and said, nope, I am marrying someone from France. It's going to be Violante. And this is actually one of the big sources of the family strife between Joan and Per. I mean, it is the source of the family strife. So anyway, Per the Ceremonious loved to marry off women from the Crown of Aragon into Mediterranean island royal families. And this is an example. So, when Joan is calling James I of Cyprus a relative, a consanguine carissime, what he's referring to is the wife of the person that James I arranged to murder. If I've got that right. I mean, I think so. And so basically, it's a little awkward, but by the time we get to 1387, all of that is kind of in the distant past. That murder was like in the 1370s, and it's been a few years, and there's been a lot of like back and forth with Genoa and the leaders in Cyprus, and they decided that they wanted James to become king, even though he had helped to arrange the murder of Peter the First, because maybe Peter the First was not that popular. I don't know. I didn't really get all that deep into the story of this tumultuous time in the leadership of Cyprus. But James I at one point made enemies out of the Genoese, and he was in a Genoese prison when it was decided by the people of Cyprus, the leadership in Cyprus, to make him king. He was actually in jail in a Genoese prison, and he had to like journey back to Cyprus from that imprisonment. And as part of the deal to let him leave, the Genoese said you had to make sure that we kept a lot of our power and status in Cyprus. Like Famagusta was like very much a Genoese town, like dominated by Genoese mercantile interests. So that's the story with James I, who is still in 1387 going strong as the king of Cyprus. And by this time, he's really turned against Genoa. So in that regard, they are of like mind. Joan is very much against Genoa, as most in the Crown of Aragon would be, because these are the rivals, right? The Catalan merchants from Barcelona. They are really all over the Mediterranean in a contest for dominance against Genoa. So that's the main rivalry. So that's probably the reason that this document exists, because there is a knight, a milite, named Hugo de Santa Pace. Or, I think in maybe better Catalan, the way to say that is Hugo de Santa Pau. All right. Who was Hugo de Santa Pau? Well, we don't really have a lot of information, but somehow this guy, Hugo, who's connected to, I think, this place in I think, Catalonia, he winds up as a vassal of the king of Cyprus. And he has not been in Cyprus. Confusingly, he's been in Barcelona for some reason. So the whole purpose of this document is to ask the king of Cyprus to allow this Hugo to have his feudal dues, or like his homage, or like whatever he needs to do for being a vassal of the king of Cyprus, to have it carried out by proxy. That's the whole reason why Joan is writing to the king of Cyprus, because there's this knight named Hugo that's been hanging out in Barcelona, and he's supposed to be back in Cyprus, but he's not. And what Joan says as the reason that Hugo has not journeyed back to Cyprus is that Hugo was waiting for Joan's coronation. What does that have to do with anything? Why does Hugo need to stay for the coronation? What is Hugo's role in the coronation? I have no idea. But that's the reason that Joan is writing in this letter for Hugo to be able to have his feudal responsibilities handled by some proxy to get the King of Cyprus's permission for him to stay in Barcelona. But there's a reason why the coronation has not happened yet, and there's a delay, and that's what Joan feels the need to explain in more detail, and that's where the real knockout feature of this letter comes through, because in line 8, Joan says that the coronation was supposed to happen in the month of May, mensis Madi, but then in line 9 of this document on folio 2R, Joan says that it could not be done because of nostri corporis distentiam. His body, there was a problem. His body was not functioning. Like, I can't quite get the resonance of the word choice here for how Joan communicates that he was ill, but it's basically saying like his body was not good. There was like some kind of distentium. There was a problem with his body, and so the coronation had to be delayed. And then he, in the first line of folio 2V, continues with that idea, saying, cumque nondum personae nostra. And then he says, necessitas hoc prometrat, something like that. It has to be delayed. Like, it's because my body, he's saying our body, nostra persona, needs to have a delay in the coronation ceremony, and therefore Hugo can't go back to Cyprus right now. Please excuse him from his obligations that he would otherwise have to go back to Cyprus to fulfill to you, his lord. All right. This is a document, it's so rare that we have this, where Joan is admitting, or his people, because we don't have a mandawit mihi in the probata for this document, but they're referring to the king's physical body in such this first person way that it's hard to imagine that Joan had nothing to do with this, that they wrote this without his permission. That's what you're going to do. You're going to write without the king's permission, that his body wasn't up to it, that his coronation had to be delayed. Maybe, well, I don't know. Maybe it was common knowledge at this point and it wasn't such a big deal. But it seems to me like here we have an example where it's a document coming from court officials and none of the apparatus indicates that the king himself was involved in the composition, but it's hard for me to believe, and maybe I just have to adjust to the norms here, but it is hard for me to adjust the idea that Joan had no part in this, that this was written without him okaying the reference to his own severe illness. Well, what is the apparatus? The probata reads, and this is another weird thing, where it starts with per de beniore, that's not weird, mandawit, and then we've got something like regem of some kind, and then facta per. All right, so that means it was made by, and then we've got another person. We've got Berenguer de Parpetuso. I don't recognize that word. And then it's like something on the third line of the probata, something like a cavier, like nostri cavier, something like that. It's really hard to read what that first tiny word with like 4 minims is supposed to say. But then we've got the word for night, I think, something like caverial. I just don't know. And then at the end of the text block, we have our usual Vice Chancellor Franciscus Sacosta. So here we have it, a direct reference in the records of the king to the fact that his body was causing problems. So it's a rare moment of visibility for the king's disability. And I am going to be really curious to see how frequent this emerges as we continue looking at documents from around this time. Maybe they're only comfortable saying this because they know that Joan has recovered enough that he's no longer in the danger zone by June 13th. That would kind of match what Violante wrote yesterday. So it's possible. All right, a kind of corroboration there, but still they are so intent on promoting the idea that Joan is strong and not about to die for their own reasons. Like, all the incentives point to them creating a picture of Joan in good health, or good enough. So what are we to make of this? What are we to make of this? Is it some dramatic break in protocol? Or is it a shift and the new protocol is not quite as dramatic as I'm reading it currently? Thanks for listening to this episode of The Historian's Notebook, Season 1, Molt Cara Companiona. If you are leaving with more questions than you arrived with, I've done my job. Because remember, the motto of The Historian's Notebook is dissatisfaction guaranteed. That means good history always raises more questions than it answers. Visit the website to see an image of today's document and additional show notes, and listen again tomorrow to hear about the next day in the first year of the reign of King Joan I of Aragon and Queen Violante de Bar. In the meantime, take care.